Well, good afternoon, everybody. Father Ben Brown again at St. Ambrose with Karen Wright taping. And this is the last section of Right Place, Right Time, the memoir I'm working on. The last section that I have written. I hope are going to be many more sections. But in case you were not with us yesterday, I have written up to about the American Civil War, trying to give background to what it means to me to be a priest in Kentucky. And in doing that for one of my professors, she found the what she called ancient history kind of tedious, so she said do some more recent history, and she also asked me to take on an issue of conflict. So the portion that I'm reading now that began yesterday is 1969 to 1973. The conflict is the discernment that I was in during those graduate school years about the issue of whether or not to become a priest, whether or not to be ordained. And if I were to do that, would it be because I felt God was calling me to ordained ministry, or my father was calling me to it? My dad seemed to have a lot of emotional investment in my becoming a priest, and I needed to discern whether or not I was doing it to please him or because I felt God wanted me to. Read about half of that section yesterday, going to finish it today. And just to put it in context again, or zero in a little bit, I had mentioned about halfway through the graduate school years doing a program at Indiana University at Bloomington. Some of us from St. Meinrad attended there, and four of us in particular from St. Meinrad went there together. And we had been in school together ever since the St. Thomas days as pretty much as high school freshmen. Keith Boone from Lebanon Junction, Harry Hagan from Bardstown, Tom Hildenbrand from the Germantown section of Louisville, and yours truly from the West End section of Louisville. And where we were when we stopped yesterday was I had completed that semester, that spring semester of 1971 at IU Bloomington. I had made a little holiday trip, a little vacation trip out west, helping one fellow from Ohio drive another fellow from California home. Art was the passenger, Tom was the car owner, and I was the co-driver. And we did that trip in June then of 1971. And now I'm returning to St. Meinrad for the summer. So I returned to St. Meinrad for a summer session which was required to complete some elements of their curriculum which had been offered while we were away at IU Bloomington. There were a couple of major differences from my earlier semesters. Harry, Bill, Tom, and Keith, my classmates for 10 years. I'm sorry, I said that with the wrong pause, because Harry Hagan was known as, and still is known by family and friends, as Harry Bill. So anyway, Harry Bill, Tom, and Keith, my classmates for 10 years, had all made major changes. We came together for a meal before I had left for California. Tom announced that he would be joining Volunteers in Service to America, VISTA, a domestic version of the Peace Corps. Keith announced that he had been accepted to a doctoral program in ethics at Emory University in Atlanta and would soon be engaged to marry Lynn. Harry announced that he hoped to be accepted as a postulant in the monastery at St. Meinrad. He would no longer aspire to be a priest of the archdiocese. At the summer session, I met other new people, including Dennis Cousins, who would play a significant part in my life, especially in the next 10 years. These first semesters of graduate study from September of 1969 through December of 1971 seem now, even more than then, to be a real mixture of elements, with a truly demanding academic load, a busy, if part-time, work travel schedule, tremendous changes in relationships with friends and family, and a great deal of discernment and reflection. The first level of ordination, referred to in those days as subdiaconate, was on the calendar for the third Saturday of March, 1972. In the midst of these fast-moving developments, there was an overriding theological question which had suggested itself to me in a particular academic exercise, but would be a major consideration for the rest of my life. By the luck of the draw, my topic for a major paper in the basic course, Introduction to the New Testament, was the Epistle to the Hebrews, particularly its treatment of the priesthood of Jesus. The writer defines the priest as one who offers sacrifice. Jesus is described as the perfect priest because he offers the perfect sacrifice, the sacrifice of himself. I concluded my paper, which I was required to present orally in class, by stating all who are baptized into Christ are called to his priesthood. Then I asked the rhetorical question, to what then is one called by ordination? I had not discovered some profoundly new insight. Priesthood of the baptized had been addressed in many contexts, not least of which were several of the 16 documents from the Second Vatican Council, still less than 10 years old. The application of that scriptural theology, though, was very much to the point for me. Several classmates decided to serve in the church, but not necessarily as ordained celibate priests. I remember Denny Barbeau and Charlie Gardner, who had long careers as liturgical musicians in Illinois and Indiana, but never became priests. Dennis Cousins was a high school religion teacher who had grown up in Louisville and had received Catholic education from primary school to college. He was active in his parish as a layman and came to St. Mildred in that summer of 1971 to begin work on a master's degree. As he learned about what I had been doing in the parishes of southern Indiana, he asked about my leading singing at his parish. He took the idea of the parish council and pastor and found them, wisely I think, hesitant to hire me. In the heart of the white flight, they were a changing parish, and a white country singer with an acoustic 6-string guitar might not fill the bill. As the summer changed into the fall semester, Dennis and I promised to keep in touch. I continued that autumn with my Saturday night, Sunday morning gigs in Perry County, Indiana, near the seminary. But I had a weekend off in October and November, Thanksgiving weekend. So Dennis and the council invited me to serve at their parish for those Sundays. This was Christ the King, a church not unfamiliar to me, as it was located less than 2 miles from St. Columba, where I had attended as a child. In this rapidly changing neighborhood, this parish, with the leadership of Father Bert Rapp, pastor, and Sister Pauline Alban, school principal, became a real model of successful integration. As testimony, I can note that it continues today when neighboring ones have long been closed. By December of that year, Dennis was saying that the parish was asking me to come there instead of to St. Paul and Tell City on the weekends. I did not give him a straight answer, but indicated that something had developed which would perhaps make it possible. What had happened was that I had decided to leave St. Meinrad. Whether temporarily or permanently, I did not know. However, on the 18th of December, in an appointment with Father Daniel B. Klein, rector of the seminary, I said something like, I am not registering for the second semester. I will not be here in January. And I know this makes me ineligible to receive the order of subdeacon in March. Then he said something like, do you know that I am required to notify the draft board and your registration classification with them will shift from 4D to 1A? Maybe I gulped, knowing that my lottery number was 83 out of 366. Draft board, registration code, lottery number was everyday language for us in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Here's a quick explanation. Each date on the calendar was placed in a hopper, mixed and drawn out, much as cash gambling lottery numbers are today. The sequential number in which they were drawn would be assigned to each man obligated for the draft at the age of 18. When the military service branches began sending notifications of recruitment, they did so according to that sequence. The higher the number, the less likely one was to be drafted. The lower, the more likely. Some years the draft reached well into the 200s. Other years, fewer were needed. So when I gulped at the news that I would be 1A with a real possibility of being drafted, I said, I understand, Father, and what will be, will be. But I will not be back here anytime before January of 1973, and maybe not then. That conversation went on for a while as the head of the seminary reviewed my grades, spiritual growth, evaluations, and so on, and told me about what confidence the faculty had in me, how people were giving positive assessments of my calling and readiness to be a priest, and so on. I received more of the same when I began to speak of my decision to schoolmates and others. Lou Vallone was a bright and lovable, if opinionated and overconfident classmate from Pittsburgh who had been with us in Bloomington. I had visited in his home and those of Bob Gay, Walt Ridson, and Jim Merkel, all in Pittsburgh. I received various levels of response, which was probably reflective of the personalities. From the peer of the longest-standing acquaintance, I received a response that I really did not appreciate. Harry Bill Hagen muttered, sounds to me like you're following a fad. What was Fonzie's reaction? From what you've read earlier, you might imagine it. Phrases like time off, need for parish experience, leave of absence, etc., probably did not register too effectively with him. It did not help much when he took the news to his sisters, and my Aunt Zelma offered, Father Tom didn't have to do any of that. My boy just went right on through the seminary. Sister Marie Celine might have been some help. However, she had taught at Christ the King Parish when it was new, and she was in her first year as a Sister of Loretto in the late 1920s. Though 25 years her junior, Pauline and her fine reputation as an elementary school teacher was well known to my aunt. In fact, Pauline's aunt and namesake was a contemporary of my aunt, Sister Marie Salinas. Many times then and since, I have been asked why I left the seminary, effectively postponing an ordination which was being anticipated by a lot of people in my immediate acquaintance. You and I, dear reader, have this advantageous perspective of the years after which we can ask this question about the source of the calling, Fonzie or the Father. I did not articulate that so publicly at the time. My usual response was, I have some things to think about. I'm sure I also said, except for the meeting with Mom and Monsignor Kiefer in the spring of 1961, when we conferred in his office about the prep seminary, I have rarely, throughout these years of seminary, seen the inside of a rectory. It's a priest's residence. I had begun to a bit with the hymn-leading jobs, but I had not had in-depth conversations with priests. More to the point, the field education placements, which are now essential at all stages of seminary formation, were barely coming into being in the early 1970s. Contemporaries and seminary educators will quickly point out the deacon internship was in place before the end of the 1960s. That is certainly true, but it could not be included as part of one's discernment. Those internships for deacons only began after a man had been ordained, and that step, or being ordained a deacon, with the obligation of celibacy, even as subdeacon, entailed a lifetime commitment. I wanted field education to be a part of my discernment, just as student teaching was for educators, co-op work for engineers, residency for physicians. So, I met with Dennis Cousins during the Christmas holidays of 1971. He introduced me to his parents, as well as to Father Rapp, Sister Pauline, and others of the parish council. I leveled with them about my leaving the seminary and needing a place to live. Their offer for the leading of singing at the weekend masses was $20 per mass or room and board. I took the latter and proceeded to look for a job with income. I needed a better car. Before leaving school, I had sent letters to the Catholic high schools thinking they could employ an English, philosophy, Latin major, even if he did not have the state credentials. I was correct about that, but they would not be needing anyone before August. The factory where I had gotten all those overtime hours was happy to find a spot for me, and I was just about to take it when I received a call from Dominican Sister Mary Helen Thieneman, principal of the all-female Holy Rosary Academy not far from Churchill Downs in Louisville. One of their faculty had too much of a load, and she needed a substitute for 3 sections of sophomore religion, starting the following Monday and going till the end of the semester. I thought, I could surely last that long. I didn't know much about sophomore girls. After inviting each to say her name and one interesting fact about herself, I invited them to ask about me. Question. Mr. Brown, what kind of car do you drive? Answer. A 1972 Corvette. Shrieks, squeals, rapid breathing, until I continued, cleverly disguised as a 1962 Nash Rambler. Moans and groans and gags. Actually, they ended up liking it, since their school nickname was the Holy Rosary Ramblers. We made it to the end of the semester, and as recently as 2 months ago, I met one of those students who remembered me. Another one is currently employed in a high-profile position with the Archdiocese. Living in the rectory at Christ the King, I was not completely bereft of social life. During the Christmas holidays, I joined some classmates for our annual caroling session, which for about 5 years was hosted by classmate Herb Jarbo and his 4 sisters, whom many of us remembered from the days when Herb's parents would bring them to the local seminary on the monthly visiting Sunday. We would sing walking along Eastern Parkway near Bardstown Road in Louisville. What is now a nondescript business on the northeast corner was then a famous hamburger franchise where we always did our grand finale. I'm dreaming of a white castle. By the Christmas of 1971, many of the seminaries had become steadies, even fiancés. One of the women who was still unattached, I remember especially well from that year, Rita Mingus. By the summer, I had saved enough money to buy a new Dodge Dart. I suspect that was about the last year that it was possible to get a new car for under $2,000. Dennis Cousins and I made some trips in it. One was to Vincennes, where we parked the Dodge and took Miss Loomis, at her insistence, in her car to Canada. We also went to Atlanta to visit a classmate from summer school with whom Dennis had kept in touch. We saw there a performance of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, a stage show which was memorable for a number of reasons. Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber were 2 Englishmen who had burst onto the American scene the previous summer with something called Jesus Christ Superstar. As we would later learn, they had written Joseph nearly 4 years earlier and would go on to create much more together and separately. Another impressive feature of the performance in Atlanta was that it was staged by children in a parochial junior high school. Some other places which I began to frequent that summer of 1972 included the Abbey of Gethsemane, where Thomas Merton had been buried in December of 1968, and the neighboring mother house of the Sisters of Loretto. I knew Sister Pauline from the parish, but had also become acquainted with others since I often attended Mass in their chapel, which was on the property next door to the parish. Mary Swain, Carol Dumfrey, Regina Dry, Emmanuel Tani, and others became good friends as well as neighbors. Mary recruited me to join her in the volunteer chorus of the Kentucky Opera Association. Over 2 seasons, I was with them for Aida, The Elixir of Love, and La Boheme. Even more enjoyable were the moments with Dr. Moritz von Baumhard, who, once he learned of my seminary background, loved to talk about recordings of Gregorian chant. He and his wife were actually married in a private ceremony in the seminary's guest house chapel. The sisters were in the process of closing their high school, and Sister Emmanuel invited me to, quote, raid the leftovers of the library after the other schools had taken what they needed. What she gave me is a significant portion of my collection still. The Sisters of Loretto also brokered the sale of their property in an unusual but beautiful way. At the same time, they helped to bring to birth the New Directions Housing Corporation, a nonprofit community development agency which provides affordable housing to the many who need it in the greater Louisville area. This is but one of the ways that this prophetic group of women serve as the conscience for the church. Before the end of the spring term, Sister Pauline, learning that I had no commitment to return to Holy Rosary for the fall semester, asked me to teach in the junior high school at Christ the King. The permit to teach in a non-public school, which had served as certification, would still apply, but I was nervous about not having proper training and technique. Her message was very affirming. She said, "You teach by the way you live. You love life, and that qualifies you. Besides, Patrick is our only male teacher, and he would like some company. Sister Stephanie can take half of the curriculum, and you can take the other half." I got religion, language arts, and fine arts with grade 7 homeroom. Stephanie got math, science, and social studies with grade 8 homeroom. She also got Father Norm Riggs. That last line was not meant to be catty or suggestive, but simply a way to remember two more people who directly and indirectly contributed to my discernment in those days. Stephanie was a member of a religious community based in New Orleans. In a move typically Lauretine, that is, forward-thinking for its time, the sisters welcomed a member of a different order to teach in, quote, their school and to live in, quote, their house. Stephanie was in the midst of some personal reflection and discernment of questions regarding her future as a celibate sister. Norm was a Kentuckian from a large family who had been a priest of the Archdiocese for about 7 years. His brother Sherman had been in my seminary class, but was now in law school. Father Riggs was associate pastor at Christ the King, and for a time shared the residence where I lived with Father Rapp. We had some good conversations about civil rights, about the war in Vietnam, about implementing the changes from the council, about the possibility of optional celibacy. There were also soul-sharing sessions about priests and religious who we knew were leaving from the Archdiocese, from the schools, including Loretto and their counterpart for boys down the street. This was run by the Brothers of St. Francis Xavier and called Flagey after our founding bishop. Norm and Stephanie and others were gracious to take me, a younger man, into their confidence, knowing I was pondering many of the same life-changing issues. On the 7th of November of 1972, President Richard Nixon defeated Senator George McGovern, thus winning a second term. Negotiators from Washington as well as Saigon and Hanoi in Vietnam had been engaged in the Paris peace talks for 4 years, having begun less than a week after Nixon's first inauguration. In reality, several peace proposals dating back to at least 1964 had been disregarded or rebuffed. The seductive domino theory was, I believe, one of the reasons for the quagmire, stalemate, sinfulness in which we were enmeshed. It is no wonder that we responded so resoundingly to John Lennon and Yoko Ono's lead, singing, "All we are saying is give peace a chance." I know I sang it when I joined Pat Compton and his wife Karen Nuz and her sister Nancy, bringing in the new year on the night of the 31st of December, 1972. I sang it with a larger crowd 3 weeks later on the Mall in Washington, D.C. Visiting at Loretta Mother House during the holidays, I learned of an organized bus trip to Washington for the purpose of protesting Nixon's second term, even as he was being inaugurated. A specific action which many found so egregious was what has come to be known as the secret bombing of Cambodia. One wonders how a bomb can be secret. That's reminiscent of a poster often seen at those rallies. Fighting for peace is like effing for chastity. The bombing of Cambodia had been going on for several years, but what was happening in the waning weeks of 1972 did not have the approval of Congress, thus the adjective secret. The bus was leaving on Thursday night, the 18th, from Louisville and returning after the rally. Presidential inaugurations take place at noon. I calculated that if the bus left Washington by 6 p.m. and there was no ice or snow, I could be back in time to lead the singing at Christ the King's first Mass of the morning. I got the okay from Father Rapp and signed on. When I told Father Riggs what I was doing, he said, I do hope you get that, Father Riggs said, I do hope that bus gets you back here for Sunday's Mass. It is going to be my last one. He stopped serving as a priest and moved out of the rectory the following Monday. I have memories of singing on the bus, of making posters and placards on a gymnasium floor in a D.C. suburb, of the frosty air, happily without snow or ice, of the area in January. But one more memory stands out. A platform had been constructed for us on the mall, probably about 2 blocks west of the Capitol. Of course, a massive one was in place at the Capitol itself for the official party of the inauguration. Using the Capitol, the Washington Monument, the obelisk, the Lincoln Memorial as place markers for the east, middle, and west positions of the mall at that moment of history, we were about midway, left side, that's Pennsylvania Avenue, of the Washington obelisk. The parade, by tradition, would move from the Capitol to the White House, passing on our left, the north side. Our crowd was vocal, if not massive, and our leader was not an orator of the prophetic stature of Martin Luther King, Jr. However, Bella Savitsky-Abzug was also not insignificant. With Gloria Steinem, Shirley Chisholm, and Betty Friedan, she was a founding member of the National Women's Political Caucus. In 1970, she won her first term in the U.S. House of Representatives, defeating a 7-term incumbent to serve as the Democratic representative for Manhattan's West Side. In 2 subsequent terms, her expanded district also included the Bronx. With her fellow, I should have dropped my voice. In 2 subsequent terms, her expanded district, in addition to Manhattan's West Side, also included the Bronx. With her fellow New Yorker Ed Koch, she introduced the first federal gay rights bill, known as the Equality Act in 1974. As chair of the Subcommittee on General Information and Individual Rights, she presided over hearings on government secrecy. Voted by her colleagues the 3rd most influential member of the House of Representatives, according to U.S. News and World Report, she was often caricatured with her flamboyant hats. When they were banned from the House chamber, she said, "It's what's under the hat that counts." At about 1 p.m. on that cloudy, cold inauguration day, the Honorable Bella Abzug under one of those big hats, spoke into a microphone, "Does anyone know all the words to Blowing in the Wind?" An erstwhile seminary student from Kentucky shouted, "Hell yes!" The speaker said, "Get that guy up here." She pulled me under her hat, and several hundred of us sang all three verses, with encores of "The Times They Are Changing" and "We Shall Overcome." The Congresswoman went to South Vietnam on appointment by President Ford to assess the situation in February of 1975. The next year, she narrowly lost the nomination for the Senate to Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who served 4 terms in that office. Ben Brown went back to Kentucky, where he still had some discerning to do. Back in Louisville, my trip to Washington had not gotten much attention. I don't really remember talking to Daddy about it. I do remember a candid snapshot which someone took of me with my beard and a peace symbol around my neck, standing next to Daddy in his Archie Bunker chair. Gwen, a senior political science major at the University of Louisville and an alto in the opera chorus, had been my seatmate on the bus ride and poster-making partner in Washington. She lived in the St. Matthews area neighborhood not far from my parents' home on Dayton Avenue at Iowa Road. She would occasionally stop by on her bike ride if she saw me in the backyard. One day, Daddy was at his best, telling Gwen, "If he doesn't get back to the seminary, I'm calling the draft board and they can ship his ass to Vietnam." In reality, they probably would not have shipped my ass or any other part of my anatomy to Vietnam, since Brother Bob was completing his tour while Brother Sam was making his second tour. They also both served in Korea. During their time in Vietnam, they also met up with Father Al Hartledge, a priest who had served at St. Columba, the church and school we had attended in the West End. Another reason why the draft board was no longer interested in me was that my, quote, obligated exposure was complete. The military adjusts its rules and quotas to meet its immediate needs. So with the de-escalation of the war in 1972, I was only in my 1A status for 90 days, obligated exposure, 1 January to 31 March. And the draft was suspended for those months, so I became 1Y. Tom Hildenbrand and Keith Boone's classifications changed probably to 2A and 2S, respectively, since Tom was considered a teacher and Keith a student. I attended both their weddings, for Tom to Rosemary in Long Island, New York, and Keith to Lynn in Bloomington, Indiana. On another day in that late winter of 1973, I stopped at the Dayton Avenue house and invited some companions to sit at the picnic table in the yard while I got us some cold beverages. These were several high school students whom I would occasionally transport in groups to recreation centers. There were basketball courts aplenty in our neighborhood near Christ the King, but usually they were in high demand. I knew that I could take these guys to the seminaries on Lexington Road, Southern Baptist, Louisville Presbyterian, and not have to wait for a court. Steve Bishop, Joe Lesh, Mike Fitzgerald, and Mark Archer were white. Reggie Packer, Kenny Hobby, Newt McCravey, and Livy Holder were black. As I was getting a pitcher of ice water in the house, Daddy said to me, "What the hell is wrong with you bringing that West End riffraff," he used the N-word, "to this house? Why the hell do you think I moved here?" Now, since you have read that I went to Washington in that January of 1973, and that I returned to Louisville, where I was still working at Christ the King School and Church, you may have surmised that I had also not returned to St. Meinrad, apropos of my conversation with Father Daniel in December of 1971. You would be correct in your surmisal. In fact, my other classmates who had continued on as seminary students were also not at St. Meinrad during that winter-spring semester of 1973. However, they had been ordained as subdeacons back in March of 72 and had become deacons according to the schedules of their dioceses and the seminary in the spring, summer, or fall of that year. In holy orders now, they were serving in pastoral internships around the country and were in the final semester of preparation for the priesthood. Part of the preparation was a 4-credit seminar which brought them together for 2 days about every 5 weeks, beginning after the J term. For the previous 6 semesters of graduate level academic study, the continually recurring pedagogical dynamic was the question, how do we apply this theory in practice? In the internship seminars, that was reversed. What is the theological background to what we are experiencing on the job? Each deacon had a mentor with whom he consulted around this and other questions. That person came with the student to the seminar at the seminary, during at least one of which the student or deacon made a formal presentation, a case study, in which he described an experience in the ministry, then reflected on it, and welcomed further discussion among his peers and their mentors, as well as the school faculty. I should say how I, who was not a deacon, found myself in the deacon internship seminar. When Sister Pauline asked me to continue teaching in the junior high department of the school, I appreciated the invitation as a venue for discernment of possible careers outside of the priesthood, as well as another confidence builder. For his part, Father Rapp, who during those same years was pursuing the Doctor of Ministry degree at the Presbyterian Seminary, was happy to share his pastoral responsibilities and have serious conversation about them, especially after Father Riggs' departure. So somewhere in the fall of 1972, I made a successful proposal to the academic dean at St. Meinrad and obtained admittance to this part of their program, an exception to policy. My thinking was that it still did not commit me to ordination, and if and when I did feel that call, I would have one less required semester. The implication of this decision reached considerably further. Even without recalling the details of any case studies besides my own, I do remember some stories which in another setting might be called bloopers. I often think of these when people ask if it bothers me for comedians to mock religion. I usually say, not too often, but the funniest stories are the real ones. One deacon, whose role it is to solemnly proclaim the gospel reading at Mass, read on the feast of the baptism of the Lord that, quote, Jesus went down to be baptized by Jordan in the John, unquote. Another fellow was at a care facility for the elderly where he was teaching a group about the changes in the sacrament of extreme unction, where formerly we waited until a patient was, using a modern expression, actively dying, before anointing with holy oil. We now do the sacrament anytime a person is ill, facing surgery, or even at regular intervals as expression of our companionship with the Lord in time of weakness. As this young deacon was preparing the group for the priest's approach to each individual for the sacrament, one woman jumped up saying, "Please don't put the oil on me. I'm improving. I may go home soon." Bolted out of the room. Then there was Dave's story from northern Ohio. He was visiting a couple in their isolated farm home where they had been living without the benefit of marriage for many years. The gentleman was a veteran of World War I who had come home to find that his pre-war bride had left him. After a few years, he met this nice lady, and when their Catholic Church would not bless their love because the man's previous wife was still living, his new friend nonetheless moved in with him, and they had kept that arrangement for now over 50 years. Preparing to meet their God, they said, they were wondering about getting back into the good graces of the church. Checking his canon law instructions, Dave asked if they were willing to, quote, refrain from performing the conjugal act, unquote. When their stares at him and each other remained blank, Dave thought it might be their hearing, so he asked the question a little louder. Still blank stares. Then he said, "Will you stop having sex?" Their laughter was so vivid, Dave thought they might become ill or spasmodic. He didn't know if they were laughing because sex was a thing of their past or because of the Church's silly idea of making rules about the bedroom of 90-year-olds. My case study was based on a person who had confided to me that he felt called to the priesthood. We could, of course, choose from any number of experiences we had encountered in context of pastoral ministry, but for me, this was the perfect fit. This man would be addressing the very questions that I was discerning so intently myself. To what is one called in ordination? How does that calling differ from the calling all experience in baptism? Remember the letter to the Hebrews? From whom does the call come? Surely God, but where do others fit in? What about the lifestyle, the vows? Should one serve in an order or as a secular priest? Isn't it possible to serve in church ministry without being a priest? The individual in my case study was Dennis Cousins. When the internship semester was completed, I had decided to request the Archbishop's permission to complete priesthood studies at St. Meinrad, and Dennis received permission to begin his. My decision had, of course, been made gradually. I do remember, however, a moment in which it became clear, or in which I articulated it clearly. Many times I've reflected on a particularly insightful comment from a mentor of the college years, Father Gavin Barnes, a man who had wonderful insight. He was a monk and professor in the Department of Speech and Drama, and I took enough of his courses to have a minor along with a major in English. Father Gavin, though, was also a personal advisor. During one particular dialogue, perhaps feeling stressed about people leaving the ministry, I said something like, "Father Gavin, I just want to be sure before I'm ordained." His very liberating response was, "Ben, if you could be sure, it would be science. This is about faith." By March of 1973, I had reflected on many questions, including this one, which I asked rather bluntly of the Christ the King Parish Council. Am I being naive when I sense that this racially mixed congregation is comfortable with the way I lead singing? Louis Moss, Jim Alexander, Carolyn Grundy Baker, James Blinko, Newt McCravey were some of the black members of the parish leadership who offered this feedback. Ben, when you lead singing, there is an honesty and genuineness about it. You are not contriving a style. You're leading with your own style. Because of that, what you are doing is really prayer. That is what people want and need in any culture. It helped me to sense that the calling was coming from the congregation, the people of God. But the calling must come in the Roman Catholic Church from a bishop. In my case, the Most Reverend Thomas J. McDonough, Archbishop of Louisville. If ordination was to happen in the local church, I needed to talk to him. What would I say? He would be asking about the time away from the seminary, how I had spent it, what insights I had now that I did not have earlier. He would have been kept abreast of my status by the priest who was appointed vicar for seminary students, that's also known as vocation director, Father Nick Rice. But the Archbishop would pastorally want to hear directly from me. Before asking for an appointment, I did a sort of spontaneous dress rehearsal. Deacon Lou Vallone, one of the buddies from Pittsburgh, spent a couple days with me at Christ the King in late March. On a neighborhood walk, I remember sitting down on a step leading into the entrance of Loretta High School and starting with this sentence. There seems to be enough about ministry and the priesthood that will be productive of satisfaction and fulfillment, to offset that which in the priesthood will be inevitably productive of frustration and loneliness. I am sure I also said, apropos of Father Gavin's sage advice, I don't have to be sure, and that's good, because I can't be. And even if I won't always feel divine guidance, I can trust that it will be there. Louis and I have talked often about celibacy and more particularly about generating offspring. His coming from Lebanese and Italian parents seemed to give a cultural coloring to the issue for him. I felt it to some extent simply as I noticed feelings that would well up in me as I began to attend confirmations and graduations for nieces and nephews. But with so many, I don't think I ever felt that as a dominant sort of emotion. And though I would sense this much more later, I really felt that some experiences in ministry would have a similar effect of generating life. There would be other thoughts both before and after my visit to the Archbishop and Father Rice. But the visit with Lou was the first time I remember being clear that I had made a decision. I seem to recall asking Father Rapp a more mundane question, like, how do I decide when is a good time to meet with the Archbishop? Father Rapp said, that's easy. You meet with him when he tells you to. In reality, Father Rice probably told me when the appointment would happen. He certainly told me about some things to expect. I had heard about one major change because it affected Catholic clergy all over the world. The order of subdeacon had been eliminated. It had become archaic after Vatican II, and its primary element, the promise of celibacy, was absorbed into the order of deacon. Another change was more local, although not unique to our diocese. Father Rice told me that all new students would need letters of recommendation and a clinical personality inventory and profile. I would not need the letters, and I had an option for the profile. I was happy to take advantage of that opportunity. There would be a required retreat, which I could design myself subject to the vocation director's approval. Deacon ordination would be scheduled at the Archbishop's convenience, but 6 months prior to projected priesthood ordination, 25th of May, 1974. As the academic year came to a close, both with the seminary internship program and the junior high semester at Christ the King, there were celebrations and travel. In spite of our threat to cut off ecclesiastical diplomatic relations with the Diocese of Pittsburgh, they ordained my classmates on the 5th of May in 1973, Derby Day. I went to the ordinations. In Louisville, Bob Abel, Tom Gentile, and Joe Stoltz, men whom I had known since the teen years, became priests on the 26th of May. And I made plans for a two-phased retreat. I wanted it to include an element of the church's social justice ministry and the historical heritage of Kentucky Catholicism. I arranged a space to stay in the guest house at Gethsemane, but spent some time during the day at places like St. Joseph Proto-Cathedral in Bardstown, St. Rose Priory near Springfield, and the mother houses of the Sisters of Loretto and the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth. It was still 10 years before the American bishops would publish their landmark pastoral letter on war and peace. However, it was less than 10 years since Pope Paul VI, the first pope to visit America, gave his impassioned plea at the United Nations. Jamais plus la guerre. War never again. Other voices among the Catholic community were making me proud to be a part of this network. On the 16th of May, after a day of prayer and discussion, a group of us set out for pizza to celebrate because someone had said, "It is Luke's birthday." Sister of Loretto, Mary Luke Tobin, had been one of only 15 women who had been invited to have an official role among over 2,000 men who participated in the Second Vatican Council. She was one of 3 women who served on the Council's Planning Commission. At one point, Luke mused about the previous year and where she had been on her 65th birthday. "Oh," she said, "I was in the D.C. jail." That was when the Catonsville Nine, including Fathers Daniel and Philip Berrigan, were on trial for anti-war activities. On a visit during that retreat to St. Thomas Parish, I met Father Robert Dollinger, pastor. In addition to giving me an original copy of the definitive history of the place where Bishop Flagey had made his first home in Kentucky, Father showed me archival records which contained the bishop's signature in his own handwriting. Father Rice had explained to me that before a man is ordained, he makes his vows in a written statement, which is then signed not unlike the way a couple signs before they make wedding vows. With Father Rice serving as witness, I signed the document in the sanctuary of St. Thomas Church. When the Archbishop set the 18th of August as the date for the ordination ceremony, he told me that the completion of renovations being done at the Cathedral of the Assumption was anticipated in time for the Blessed Mother's feast on the 15th. The cathedral would be, in those days, the usual venue for ordinations. However, the Archbishop granted my request that the ceremony be held in the sanctuary at Christ the King. When he asked, "Any other special requests, Ben?" I said, "Well, since you asked, Archbishop, would you be willing to use Bishop Flagey's chalice and his chair?" He said, "Sure, but I will leave it to you to get them from the museum." He also conceded to my other request that the installation of the first extraordinary ministers of the Eucharist for the parish, Sister Pauline Alban and Mr. Jim Alexander, take place at the same Mass. Daddy was pretty excited about the plans, even if unclear about the ceremony not being in the cathedral. He would, of course, be in the first pew. In fact, the custom is that the person to be ordained be seated with his family until called by the bishop, seated on the chair, at which time the ordinand comes forward with the dalmatic, the deacon's robe, draped over his arm. Daddy was surprised, I'm sure, by the number of black people in the church, including some near the altar. Ed Branch, a native of Washington, D.C., who had left the Brothers of St. Francis Xavier and was preparing to become the first African-American priest for the archdiocese, was there. Certainly all of Daddy's gang, dear to me too, were there. Father Tom, his parents, Fred and Zelma Floden, Nellie and Matt, Sister Marie Celine, and others. In addition to Jesus and the Gospels, my mentors on the retreat included two deceased Jesuit priests, Karl Rahner and Teilhard de Chardin. Father Rahner, who had taught some of our Louisville priests in Austria, had written scholarly volumes, but also some more accessible books of spirituality. Similarly, Father de Chardin, famous for his really difficult tomes with his background in paleontology, had a beautiful meditation called Mass on the World, which I had both in print and on tape. Still do. Rahner's reflection on the priesthood and de Chardin's theology of the Mass were distilled into some practical applications and continue to inform and enrich my thinking these many years later. Jesus, who, like the temple priest, made the offering, became the perfect priest by making the offering of himself. As God, he entered fully into the human condition so that humanity could find divinity there. In his words, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. John chapter 10, verse 10. The priest's role, the role I wanted to take on, would be the one who helps people to find Christ in their lives and become enriched by celebrating his presence there. I had seen people cease to have a meaningful experience of religion. The Second Vatican Council had opened the path to changing that. I felt called by God and the people of God to be a part of that change. I had come to realize that my father, my daddy, was interested in my becoming a priest for what it would do for him. Others who called me taught me that what I might do, I would do for others. Daddy's self-centeredness did not make him a bad man. Of course, his racism was reprehensible, but all too typical of the times. He was the product of many generations of people who did not, could not, understand God as an unconditional lover, or that serving Christ means being enmeshed with serving others. Even more to the point, Daddy was the product of many generations who were taught to believe that salvation is something which must be earned. Daddy was convinced that having a son who was a priest would be his ticket, his get-out-of-jail-free card, to be played when he went before the judgment seat of God to account for his life. I never felt that he or anybody else would need such a device, And I tried mightily to convince him of that, to help him resolve that conflict. I had a lot of help resolving my conflict about the source of the call. The reality that I still find satisfaction, even fullness of life, now nearly 46 years later, is witness to trust well placed, to a decision well taken, to being in the right place at the right time. Well, everybody, there's another 65 minutes of your having to listen, although, as I said at the beginning, you got me where you want me. You can turn me on and turn me off. We have another 40 minutes to prepare for Mass for this feast of the Ascension of the Lord into heaven. And Mary is completing the wiping down the pews with disinfectant cloths. We had Masses, the first one here, since suspension was lifted, was 5:30 last evening. About a dozen of us were here. Then I celebrated Mass at St. Ignatius this morning at 10. I think there were about 8 of us there. And then at St. Clare in Colesburg, another 13 or so of us were there at noon. We are doing this disinfecting, wiping down every hard surface in the churches. And people are welcome, encouraged to come. We are using every other pew so that I can have a pew space with which to pass down the aisle, so to speak, and bring you communion rather than you walking to communion. We're asking that everybody wear a mask, and if you arrive and don't have one for you and everybody in your car, we can provide a mask for you, but we'd like to see that everybody wear a mask. And we'll continue taking these steps. I think that's all that we really need to announce at this time. Karen, of course, will be taping this afternoon Mass. She's graciously come here and done this, and she'll do the Mass this afternoon and post it to YouTube and Facebook. And then our pattern, unless we see a need to change, will be to have the Masses at the regular schedule. You know what that schedule is. It hasn't changed. 5:30 on Wednesday and Thursday here at St. Ambrose, 5:30 on Saturday here at St. Ambrose, and then Sunday morning at 8 at St. Ambrose and 10 at St. Ignatius. The Sunday Masses will be the ones that will be taped and posted. I expect at this point to continue the pattern of first Sunday of the month at St. Clare, but as I've already indicated, the Archbishop is encouraging us to have multiple Masses in multiple venues in order that people can attend, but can also spread themselves out and socially distance. So stay tuned. We'll be recording again for the next time at 8 a.m. this coming Sunday morning. Thanks, everybody. God bless. Keep in touch.